And I am going to get started. I'm Sophie Smith. I'm the Assistant Director at the York Public Library, and we're so glad to have you here tonight. I just want to go over all of the Zoom pieces just quickly. I'm sure everybody is familiar with it more than they care to admit, but just if you had forgotten, your mute and video and chat buttons all should be at the bottom of your screen where you can toggle those on or off. I would ask that you keep your microphone off during the presentation, but at the end, please feel free to unmute to ask questions. You also can use the chat to put in questions to be answered at the end, or depending on how Teresa, her flow works, she can look at those along the way, but I imagine that most likely they'll be done at the end. But in terms of a formal introduction, I'm going to pass you off to Denise Spear, who will introduce our presenter tonight.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Denise Spear. I'm a core member of Southern Maine for Racial Justice. We're happy to have Teresa Mares here with us tonight to talk about a renewed call for social sustainability, putting worker justice at the center of sustainable food systems. Dr. Mares is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Vermont and the Director for the Food Systems Graduate Program. Her research has focused primarily on issues of food access and labor justice amongst immigrant communities in the United States. She is the author of the book Life on the Other Border, Farmworkers and Food Justice in Vermont, and is currently working on a second book co-authored with Laura-Anne Minkoff-Zern entitled Will Work for Food, Labor Across the Food Systems. Thank you, Dr. Mares, for joining us this evening.
Hey, thanks everyone for coming. I love to be in Maine in person, but I also really love the ability to speak to audiences that I might not have the opportunity to visit. So I'm going to share some thoughts both about broader considerations around inequality and sustainability in the food system and focus in on some of the research that I've done in Vermont. So I'm going to start sharing my screen just so that I can help remind myself what I'm going to be talking about. And like we mentioned, we will, I'm happy to take questions at the end, have a conversation about some of these pieces, things that I'm thinking about quite a bit. So go ahead and start sharing. Okay. So the long title, a renewed call for social sustainability, putting worker justice at the center of sustainable food systems, is an area of work that I've been thinking about for about the last 12 years since I arrived in Vermont. I was hired in to be a food anthropologist, which we are kind of few and far between. But it's been a really important place for me to really develop my thinking around what equitable food justice looks like, what food dignity means, and really thinking about some of the dynamics around labor and labor systems that intersect with food. So tonight, what I'd like to do is to revisit a really influential piece of writing that I read as a graduate student, and that has continued to shape the way that I think about sustainability in the food system, which is a piece called The Social Side of Sustainability by Patricia and Carolyn Sachs. I'm going to think a little bit more deeply about these three pillars of food system sustainability and where we're at in balancing or prioritizing those pillars. Obviously, I think we've seen that COVID has played such an important role in thinking through our food system, its vulnerabilities, the places where supply chains are very weak. But what I will focus on is specifically what the pandemic is revealing around essential work in the food system. And with that, I'll focus in on food workers in the dairy industry, primarily migrant farm workers, and share some of the research that I did on food access. And then, as with, I think, any crisis, as many issues and problems as we have definitely seen with COVID, I think there's also some really important openings for social sustainability in the food system that I'd like to highlight. There we go. So this piece is now more than 30 years old, and I continue to assign it in all of my classes that deal with food, specifically my food and culture classes, because I think we've seen a lot of important work that's happening under the banner of sustainable agriculture. But what we're really sustaining and who we're sustaining, I think, is still a really open-ended question. So in this essay that was written in 1991, probably written a little bit before that, published in 1991, the feminist food scholars Patricia and Carolyn Sachs really were thinking through the emergence of the language around sustainable agriculture and what sustainability really was meaning at that point. And they argue that an essential first step in the reconstruction of the concept of agriculture is the deconstruction of dominant meanings of sustainable agriculture. This is where I think very exciting things were starting to happen. Community gardens were starting to get a lot more attention. CSAs were starting up. And there were some really interesting things that we still see as important strategies in building sustainable food systems. But what they argued is that at that point, sustainable agriculture as a set of conversations and a set of practices were really prioritizing certain elements of sustainability over others. And they believed, and I think they would still believe, that there has been this tendency to really focus on the ecological considerations of sustainability and the financial or economic dimensions, and that what they see is social dimensions of sustainability, things like hunger, lack of poverty or the presence of poverty, economic concentration, gender subordination, and racial oppression, were still very much causes of unsustainability in the food system, and they were calling for an attention to those issues. And I've told students that as soon as we have a more equal balance of these ideas, as soon as we really start integrating social sustainability into our food systems work to the degree that I think it needs to be, I'll stop assigning this old piece, but it's still relevant. And so I continue to assign it. And I think it's really helpful in thinking about where sustainable agriculture and sustainable food systems really needs to go. So what I think is interesting is this kind of triple bottom line approach, or what's often called the 3 pillars of sustainable food systems, has started to make at least kind of a nominal change in how we think about sustainability. And if you look at the definition of sustainability that is advertised by places like my own institution, the University of Vermont, this idea of sustainability meaning more than just one thing, but meaning 3 things, is, I think, a really prominent idea. But I question, as these previous scholars have, to what degree are we really prioritizing these social dimensions? Questions of injustice, questions of racial oppression, questions of sexism in the food system. I would argue that we still aren't doing enough, and that the environmental and the economic considerations take more priority over the social dimensions. I think that until we have a more equal balance of these ideas, until we really think about the social dimensions and the question of who and what are we sustaining in a real pragmatic way, that I don't really think that we're going to have sustainability in the food system in the way that is going to especially represent a vision that I have. So what I think we have seen in the pandemic is a really important opening for thinking about work and thinking about workers. And early on in the pandemic, especially as we were facing questions about what things might remain open, what things were going to be closed, who had to come to work, who had the luxury of working from home on Zoom, these questions around who counted as essential workers, or what some people argued were sacrificial workers, became a really prominent discussion around the pandemic. And what we saw, this is something that I'm writing on right now, is that certain sectors of the economy, especially the food system, were places where people were continuing to work, often at really increased rates of infection, and often with some kind of negligible safety protections put in place. And so whether it was harvesting crops and working in fields, whether it was working in meatpacking facilities or chicken processing facilities, or thinking about grocery workers, restaurant workers, those people who are working in more kind of retail dimensions, we saw that this consideration or this classification of being an essential worker meant that workers were often put into places where they were much more likely to get sick. We saw an order put forth by President Trump to keep meatpacking facilities open. It's been estimated that that decision that was also made in close collaboration with higher ups in the meatpacking industry, caused thousands of deaths in these tight quarters. And so when we think about this kind of issue of social sustainability, I think this is a really important example of where we haven't been putting the well-being of people on equal footing with economic well-being or with ecological well-being. And I think all of those dimensions are really important. As we've seen, the past 2.5 years, I think this idea of essential work has changed form. And I think that we're talking about it in some different ways. But we still see places where increased rates of infection or increased likelihood of not being able to socially distance or even stay at home because of the lack of having a paid sick day has made food workers really vulnerable to this particular pandemic and likely to future pandemics as well. And so this consideration of labor and who counts as an essential worker, what that means, what kinds of protections it comes with or what kinds of protections it doesn't come with, has been something that I'm thinking quite a bit about as I am working on this new book with my colleague Laura-Anne, where we're trying to understand really what fair work might look like across the food system and the various barriers that stand in the way of getting there. And I think that this idea of essential work is kind of a double-sided thing where we have the opportunity to see how valuable and important these workers are to our lives. At the same time, that classification puts them at risk. And so something that I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about. I want to bring it a little bit closer to home, at least to my home, and not too far from probably where a lot of you are. And think about some of these considerations with the ethnographic work that I've been doing and that I started doing nearly as soon as I entered Vermont. So I got hired at UVM in 2011, and that was after living in the Seattle area for a number of years doing my graduate work. And in Seattle, I was really interested in, through my dissertation, exploring how immigrant families were meeting food needs. And in an urban context, that meant a lot of different things. That meant going to Food Not Bombs distribution sites. That meant cultivating community gardens, going to hot meal programs, buying food at the Mexican stores that actually are pretty predominant in certain parts of Seattle. And then I moved to Vermont, which is a very different place. When a very rural place. I think Maine and Vermont trades the dubious honor of being the least ethnically diverse state in the country. And it was in many ways a shock to the system, thinking about how would I continue looking at these questions of food sovereignty, of food justice, and equitable food access in a place that was pretty far removed and very different from what I had looked at before. And so I started this work in 2011 and engaged in a long-term ethnographic project that has a lot of applied dimensions that I'm happy to talk more about until right after the 2016 election, when I stopped collecting data and I started writing. And this book came out in 2019 and is something that I'm still kind of tinkering with and thinking about some of the threads that came out of it. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But what we know is that Vermont is a place that is probably not the first place that comes to mind when you think about migration from Mexico. And when I was interviewing for this job in Vermont, I was kind of pitching this idea that, if you hire me, I'm going to come and do this work. I did some preliminary research and, I'm really interested in the dairy industry and the work of Mexican workers in that industry. And someone raised their hand. They said, well, how are you going to do that? There's no Mexicans in this state. And I think both that sort of prevalent invisibility and maybe the lack of true examination into what the state really looks like, who's really living here, has presented a number of problems for thinking about social sustainability in this context. So what we know in Vermont, a state, roughly 650-ish thousand people, not a very small state, that there's roughly 1,000 to 1,200 farm workers from Latin America. And primarily, these workers are coming from southern Mexico, heavily indigenous states like Chiapas and others. Some people are coming from Central America, mostly from Guatemala, and that most of these workers are undocumented, and they're mostly men. Although there are women that are here both working on dairies and who have come to join their male partners. I presented this figure alongside a dairy farmer from the Upper Valley at a conference, and he kind of leaned over. He's like, "It's closer to 99%, Teresa. It's more than 90%." And so this issue of documentation was one that came up really prominently in the work that I did. I entered this work thinking about looking at food access and food security, and then citizenship and citizenship barriers, and race and racism and border dynamics were really things that came out without me necessarily looking for them, but I couldn't help but pay attention to them. And so an important thing to know, and I think especially thinking about the differences between what might be happening in Maine and what might be happening even in other places in Vermont, is that currently there is no legal pathway into finding work in the dairy industry. Part of that is how we define agricultural work visas, or the H-2A visa program. The H-2A visa program is the program that brings seasonal workers into lots of different places, probably every state, and a lot of workers from Mexico for seasonal work, right? That might be picking blueberries, that might be processing fish, that might be picking apples in orchards. But because the H-2A visa program has been really formulated around those seasonal work needs, dairy workers don't qualify for that because they work year round. And the fact that we do produce milk year round is kind of unnatural, and it's all about keeping cows continuously pregnant and, really controlling their reproductivity. So if a worker wants to come in to the United States and work in dairy, there's basically no legal pathway in doing so. And so I think these barriers and these issues of citizenship are really important when we think about how people access basic needs, because Vermont is also a border state, and no matter how progressive the state might be or how much, really important organizing work there is happening, we still have CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, and ICE agents in the state that are patrolling that national border. So this dilemma really presents a number of challenges for farm workers who are trying to get food, healthcare, go to church, visit their kids' schools, any of those kinds of things. And that's why this book is entitled Life on the Other Border, because this experience of living and working in Vermont is a continuation in many ways of the violence of crossing the US-Mexico border. I want to pause and just talk about, there is, currently some ideas around expanding the H-2A visa program to include dairy workers, and elected representatives in Vermont have expressed support for that idea. Farm worker organizations like the United Farm Workers have also expressed support for the Farm Worker Modernization Act. In Vermont, there's a number of people who are actively opposed to that, actually in a lot of places, people who are actively opposed to that, because it really upholds that H-2A visa program as a good model, as the model that we want to replicate for any agricultural worker. But what we know is that that H-2A visa program is far from problem-free, and that worker abuses happen under that system, that there's just a number of problems that we don't necessarily want to replicate or extend. And for that reason, that Farm Worker Modernization Act is not agreed upon by everybody, especially farm workers, as the best solution. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I think that knowing a bit about that, not total universal acceptance of that idea is an important thing. So a couple things that I think are important to note is that, like the food system everywhere, Vermont's dairy industry has faced a huge number of challenges. And alongside labor issues, there's been a number of economic issues that dairy farm workers have faced alongside dairy farm owners. Dairy farm ownership is an extremely volatile job. Milk prices are extremely volatile. The production in Vermont and the pricing that Vermont producers get for their milk is based on a standard set in the Midwest, where dairy farms are much larger in general. And what we've seen in Vermont, in New York State, in Maine, in New Hampshire, is that the dairy industry in general has become really consolidated and really industrialized, where now we have far fewer players in control of that industry. And the sort of average family farm that might have existed in the 1940s, it's really hard to continue to produce at that scale. So in the 1940s in Vermont, we had 11,000 dairies. We have currently, as of 2020, a couple of years ago, about 645 dairies. And so what's really important to note is that even with that smaller number of dairies, we're making more milk than we've ever made. So while farmers are facing the lack of economic sustainability, and while farm workers are facing the lack of social sustainability in their life, and there's currently also a ton of environmental considerations, we're making more and more milk. Part of that is, the sort of belief in economies of scale, and that if there's, a low price, you produce more of it. But part of it is also just the ways in which the dairy industry has changed. Even the technologies of bulk tanks and the availability of having milk picked up in huge amounts is part of all of this. So what we also know is that nearly 70% of Vermont's milk comes from dairies employing migrant workers, and that's about 43% of New England's milk supply. So the role of these workers in sustaining this really vital industry to the state is significant. And we also know that Vermont is the most dependent state on one agricultural commodity in the nation, and that commodity is milk. And so there's been an interesting set of discussions in the state about this dependence on farm workers, about not only the economic dependence, but the agricultural dependence on these workers. And our elected representatives at the governor level even have been stating publicly how important these workers are for our state, even as they're facing risk of being detained and deported. They're facing racialization and bias policing. There is this kind of currently really complicated mix happening in the state. So I chose to look at food access and food access being an important issue that is classed and racialized and gendered, and certainly has dynamics shaped by citizenship. And what we know is from other studies on farm worker food insecurity is that farm workers experience food insecurity sometimes 3 to 4 times what the national average is. And I think this is one of those facts that is so bewildering about the food system, right? How are food workers and farm workers who are directly responsible for our own food security going hungry, right? I think that is something that we see not only in farm workers, but among cafeteria workers and farmers and restaurant workers, that this sort of inability to feed oneself is linked to a lot of different things, poverty level wages, lack of living wages, but it's also this sort of important problem in our food system that I think we need to really come to terms with. Prior to me doing this work in Vermont, there was no data about food security within the farm worker population in Vermont or in New England. And so what I set about to do is try to understand, well, how are Vermont farm workers faring relative to other farm workers in other places? And most of those studies were done in seasonal work arrangements, people picking tomatoes or people picking lettuce, where there's significant seasonal variability in how much people are earning. So I'm also an anthropologist, and while I do cite numbers and I do look at these kinds of quantifiable data, I'm also really interested in the stories and the narratives that people share about food security. And this picture on the left is a picture taken inside a farm worker home in Vermont. And these green things laying on the floor of this bedroom are tomatillos. They were tomatillos that were grown by this particular farm worker who had a garden plot at the dairy where he was working. And to me, this is actually another way of understanding food insecurity, or food security in this case, where this individual, probably for at least the next several weeks, if not several months, would have access to this particular item that has a lot of cultural meaning and is really essential to a number of culturally familiar dishes. He also knew that tomatillos keep really well, even unrefrigerated, if they are kept in their husk, which these are. And especially when we look at housing that has sometimes not that great of heating, this was his way of storing this food. And so one of the things that I've done alongside my research is to connect with farm workers through a project called Huertas, which is a gardening project connected with UVM Extension, where we work with farm workers who have a desire to grow some of their own food, especially get access to foods that are really hard to find in Vermont. And I've traveled quite a bit in Maine. I have family in Maine, and I know that, like Vermont, Maine is not necessarily, a hotbed of Mexican ingredients or Mexican foods, although there's a couple exceptions, I think, in both places. But if you want to access certain ingredients, it can be very hard. And so we work with farm workers who are interested in growing some of their own foods, especially things like herbs, varieties of chilies that it's really nearly impossible to get in the state. So what I found, and I think this is an interesting set of data, is that unlike those really high rates of food insecurity, 3 to 4 times the national average, my data done through the same kinds of surveys demonstrated that just about 18% of households that I interviewed and that surveyed were classified as food insecure. And that might seem like kind of a hopeful notion. Okay, well, maybe farm workers in Vermont are not doing as bad, or maybe there's, certain ways that they're doing better than their counterparts in other places. But when I was doing these surveys, which is a USDA tool, it's called the USDA Household Food Security Survey Module, I would do these surveys, which 16 questions, very straightforward. You can do them very quickly. It's translated into Spanish. And invariably, people will tell me, okay, well, Teresa, I have the money to buy the food, but I'm afraid of going to the grocery store because I'm afraid of getting Border Patrol called on me. Or, yes, I have the money to buy food, but I don't have the time to get to the grocery store because I'm working 70 hours a week. And so what I think is really important is that the ways that we measure food insecurity for immigrant households, for refugee households, are really terrible. And I think, honestly, those methods need to be redesigned, and that's part of some work that I'm doing in the future. But I think that this survey also reveals that food insecurity is much more than just having money to buy food. It's also about having a grocery store where you feel comfortable. It's about having the time to get there. It's having the transportation to get there. And those are definitely problems for farm workers in the state. So the other big kind of summary findings that I talk about in this book is that why farm workers are hungry in Vermont are very different than some of the other states that have been looked at. And that the combination of being a border state, a rural border state, having very few transportation options, and also having a lot of dependency on other people to buy food results in a very different picture of food access than we might see for people living in Seattle, right? And that was one of the big differences that I noticed, is this urban versus rural dimension. Something like 88% of farm workers in Vermont do not purchase their own grocery items. They send lists to grocery stores with either managers or volunteers. People sometimes have their bilingual children help translate those lists. And so there's just a lack of connection in general to sources of food. And that's part of why we designed this gardening project. There's also what I mentioned, this way that we measure food insecurity is very, very inadequate for thinking about immigrant households. Part of that is that most of these households are not only supporting economically family members and household members here, but they're also sending money back to Mexico or to Guatemala. And so when you apply these USDA tools, how many people in your household, okay, well, how much money do you have? Do you have enough money to feed them? Invariably, I would get questions of, are you talking about the trailer that I share with 3 young men here? Or are you also talking about my family in Chiapas that I send remittances to? And that's my own kind of paraphrase, right? And so all of these more lived dimensions of food insecurity and hunger that I think are gendered, are racialized, are about economic class, reveal themselves in a much more complicated picture. And it also doesn't really allow us to think about how do people get by in face of these challenges, and how are people really creative and inventive and resilient, not only studying the sort of lack of food as this absence. And so these data, I think, are interesting. I think that the stories that accompany them are interesting. But what's also, I think, been running through my head is, what does this point to in terms of these broader questions of social sustainability and the ways in which, when we have food and farm workers going hungry, that is not sustainable. When we have people getting higher rates of infection because they are considered essential, right, that's not sustainable. And I think that points to the continued relevance of bringing in that social sustainability kind of discussion. So when we look at Vermont, again, I think Vermont has an image and there's a reality, and both are true and both are fake, like many places. We have this idea of Vermont being this kind of, progressive haven and places that, it's a place where we can achieve a lot of things that we might not be able to achieve in other places, economically, politically. But it's also a place that has, a lot of issues to contend with. So on one side, what we saw amidst the pandemic is that because of really hard fought organizing by an organization, Migrant Justice, in collaboration with others, Vermont as a state made stimulus payments to people who were excluded from federal funding. And so that first round of payments that many of us received, if you were undocumented or married to someone who was undocumented, you were left out of that stimulus, even though those individuals were often really impacted by some of these challenges. And so Vermont actually raised or kind of harnessed a bunch of money as a state, and that money was distributed to farm workers, and that was really rare. I think there were some efforts to do this in California, but really was not part of the national response to COVID. The other thing is that even in places like my own loved and lovely cooperative City Market, of which I am a member, there has been a number of issues where grocery workers who are unionized have had varying experiences of being paid with hazard pay or not. And there was an argument the hazard pay was curtailed far too early in the pandemic, and that there were continued health concerns. And so I think what this points to for me is that we need to poke a little bit beyond the kind of image of sustainability and really think about what's truly going on. And that, Vermont opens up a number of possibilities in terms of its small size, its ability to, connect with lawmakers in ways that we might not in a much bigger state. But there's also really pervasive issues and pervasive places where we need more equity. So those are kinds of the what I would say the depressing things. There's a lot of things to be depressed about in the food system. And like I try to do in most of my classes as well, I don't like to end the conversation there because, I think there are things that we really need to be concerned about and issues and inequities that we need to address. But I think it's also as important to think about where are there things that are going well and where are there efforts that we need to replicate and we need to think about more closely. And so I want to talk about three main openings that I see, things that I'm excited about, things that pull me out of my own depression and cynicism when I look at the food system. And the first one is that I think this conversation around decolonization, around the decolonization of sustainable agriculture, and around the decolonization of food systems is really, really exciting. The fact that this is Indigenous led and we've seen some really amazing work come out, such as this book, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, and this Decolonize Your Diet cookbook, shows that this idea of undoing these really negative power relationships, undoing these violent systems is necessary for us to rebuild things that really work much better for everybody. And so I feel like this effort towards decolonization, which, admittedly, I think is really loud in higher education, right? A lot of my students are thinking about this and asking questions about this. I think that needs to be amplified. And I think that idea of decolonization is being seen in really kind of public efforts, places like, Sean Sherman's new restaurant, where he's looking at what did pre-colonial diets look like and how were they more productive of well-being for Indigenous communities. So I think that's really exciting. And I think that that's something that we need to make sure is not co-opted, but is celebrated and maybe gives us some lessons for how to come into right relations with the food that we eat and other parts of our food system. The second thing that I feel like is an incredible opening is this very explicit attention to racism in the food system and to the ways in which racism is only allowed to persist because of not paying attention to that social sustainability. And so 2 books have come out in recent years, Farming While Black by Leah Penniman and Black Food Matters, which has been co-authored by a couple of amazing anthropologists, Hannah Garth and Ashanti Reese, point to the ways in which we need to come to terms with the building of our food system on the backs of enslaved people and on stolen land. And I think also a point where we might bring together the demands that the Black Lives Matter movement makes with food and farming systems. And so this quote by Leah Penniman it kind of sends chills through my spine, that racism is built into the DNA of the US food system, beginning with the genocidal land theft from Indigenous people, continuing with the kidnapping of our ancestors from the shores of West Africa for forced agricultural labor, expanding to the migrant guest worker program, and maturing into its current state where farm management is among the whitest professions. Farm labor is predominantly brown and exploited, and people of color disproportionately live in a food apartheid neighborhoods and suffer from diet-related illness. The system is built on stolen land and stolen labor and needs a redesign. And so I think that, while this isn't directly related to the pandemic, we have seen the kind of the churning of an attention to racial justice amidst the pandemic. And I do think that the openings for anti-racism and about reparations that are connected with this history of the food system are absolutely important and give me hope. And I think the ways that this particular quote puts in a conversation, Indigenous issues with Black issues, with issues facing farm workers, is a really important recognition of some of these shared histories. The third opening that I see is really exciting is one that's much more local and one that I write a bit about in my book about the Milk with Dignity program. And so the Milk with Dignity program is something that now is many years old, actually. It's nice to be able to say that, where Ben & Jerry's has been working under this Milk with Dignity agreement, ensuring that the milk that is produced on farms that they source for their ice cream in the state is produced under conditions that farm workers have agreed upon are dignified. This model stems from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers model in Florida primarily, but looking at production of vegetables and a number of ways to put pressure on large corporations for their purchasing power and their decisions. I think this is incredibly exciting. It's very different than a traditional union model, which has certainly a huge place to or a huge role to play in food justice. But I think this idea of taking direction and taking lessons from those workers who know best what a dignified job will look like for them is incredibly exciting. Right now, and probably many of you in Maine know that the current campaign to bring a company into the Milk with Dignity program is with Hannaford Grocery. That campaign is extended and extended and extended, and to date has not been successful, but I think many people are very hopeful. And I think that would represent a really important shift in thinking about, how can we ensure that these basic commodities that we rely upon are produced in fair ways. So these three openings that I'm talking about, I think are those exact kinds of things that are called for by Allen and Sachs, thinking about the rights of workers, thinking about racial equity in the food system, and thinking about Indigenous sovereignty in the food system are all are all areas where there's been tremendous movement, but I think they need to move further. And I think that those of us who might be best serving as allies, that's some areas where we might devote some of our attention. So I'm going to close there. I think we have some time for questions and answers, or maybe at least some considerations. And thanks for being attentive. You can unmute, we can put them in the chat, whatever works for you.
Hi, could you say a little bit more about the competing ideas for modifying the H-2A visa program to accommodate dairy workers?
Yeah, absolutely. So that idea of expanding the H-2A program is not a new one, and that in our own state, Leahy has been an advocate of that idea, expanding H-2A from a seasonal program to any agricultural work that might demonstrate a labor shortage. And that's an important thing, is that what farm owners have to do to make the case for H-2A workers is really interesting. They have to demonstrate that no local workers will do that work. I think the next question is for what price, but that question is not usually asked. So there is a proposal, at various levels to expand the H-2A visa program to include workers like those that are working in dairies. And the United Farm Workers, which is, as probably many of us know, a really long-standing institution in terms of farm worker organizing. And the UFW has expressed support for that program, has made the argument that that would solve some of the issues that they see as an organization. But more locally, Migrant Justice in Vermont, and I'm happy to share some of that press, argues that that's not the answer, and that we need to really rethink in bigger, broader terms about how do we allow and how do we bring workers into this country to fill real labor needs without replicating some of the exploitative and not so great dimensions of that H-2A program. There's a really great book called Labor in the Locavore. It's written by Maggie Gray about the Hudson Valley. She goes into a lot of those details about some of the problems with the H-2A visa program. There's also a really recent journal article, actually a series of journal articles written by some people in New York. But the argument is that the H-2A program is not the model that we want to replicate, and that there's enough problems in it that first we probably need to address the problems within that program, but that we need to think about a solution for some of these labor needs that is much more fair, and that doesn't allow for some of those possibilities that H-2A program does. That said, it's really interesting because I think in Vermont, just if you're in this state in the fall, a number of the orchards in the state are dependent upon workers coming in from Jamaica. And there's these long histories of Jamaican workers, the same workers coming year after year after year, and relationships that are built between those workers and the places where they're working. And, because of that H-2A visa, people are in public, and they're not necessarily afraid in the same ways that farm workers in the dairy industry are. And so, I think that it's a complicated issue, but it's currently a pretty big disagreement about whether that's the right way to go. I'm happy to share a couple things in the chat, even if you're interested. Yeah. Any other questions? I know it's getting late. Feels really late here when it starts getting dark so early. I know we've got a ways to go, but any other questions or conversations we might have?
I was curious sort of about how some of the sort of ethnographic work and then its representation in the Most Costly Journey, sort of how that has been received and used to help sort of make this a little more accessible. I think not, that's maybe not the right word, but I read that and I found it really impactful to see stories represented sort of through this method. And hearing this part of it, I think really adds to that. So I'm curious how something like that has interlaced to help this.
Yeah, I think that part of, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool ethnographer. My method is to talk to people and hear their stories and try to connect those stories both with each other and with audiences that those stories might need to reach. And so I feel like that method is one that you have to take great care with, because these aren't my stories. These are not, this is not my life. These are not my experiences. Although it did turn out, I share this, that I was about 5 years into this project and I was talking with my father and he's like, oh yeah, back when we used to pick sugar beets in the summer. And it's like, wait, what? Turns out my dad was a farm worker. And it was something that was never shared with me as a source of his own family kind of history. And so I think taking great care with those stories and amplifying them in ways that don't pretend to be unbiased, I think is a really important thing. Is that in this book, it's pretty clear what my perspectives are. I don't think, sorry, my dog is seeing a rabbit in the grass, but not pretending like, that I don't have an insight into some of these problems and that I don't have an insight into what needs to be potentially rectified. I think that that's a really a clear stance that I take. In full disclosure, I was on the board of Migrant Justice for many years. I'm currently on sabbatical from that while work is currently kind of overwhelming. But I think that ethnography and storytelling and this kind of ethnography that I choose to do can be used really carefully to illuminate issues of injustice that are often really hidden, and that sometimes the veneer of a progressive, wonderful Bernie Sanders utopia can cover up in a lot of ways. At the same time, there's stories that farmers need to share and do share about the challenges that they have, and that's, I think, also really important to pay attention to. I don't know if that at all got to what you were asking, Sophie, but I waxed poetic about ethnography for a minute. I think it's also, to get into that storytelling piece just a little bit more, this is an academic book. It's published by an academic press. It has a particular audience. I tried to make it as accessible as I could, but the first chapter is a little bit of heavy lift, I know. And I think one of the other projects that I've been involved with is a comics project called The Most Costly Journey, or El Viaje Más Caro. And that was in collaboration with the Open Door Clinic, the Vermont Folk Life Center, and a cartoonist, Merrick Bennett, where primarily started as a public health project, tried to address some of the mental health concerns that farm workers were experiencing. We collected these stories, we put together these graphic novels and self-published this book a couple of years ago. And really exciting, was picked as Vermont Reads book for the year. And so the Vermont Humanities Council is putting copies of this book in all the libraries in the state, and school children are reading it. And that is another dimension of this story, and another really accessible dimension that I think I hopefully brought an ethnographic sensitivity to, but is a far bigger audience than my book is definitely reaching. So I think it's, it's also doing talks like this. It's, talking at WIC conferences like I'm prone to do. I think that the book is one slice of what I'm trying to convey, but, was an important one for my career. Any other questions? Well, I encourage you all, if you ever would like to, you feel free to reach out. Some of you may not know, but Denise's daughter, who's also on this call, was one of my students and advisees And it's so lovely to have continued connections even after she's graduated. But if you're interested in learning more about this book or the project, or the gardening project or the comics project, feel free to reach out. It's really nice to be able to share some things to people who have an interest in these topics. And there's a lot of important parallels between Vermont's food system and Maine's food system, and agricultural labor and labor that comes into your state. And hopefully we'll get a chance to learn more about that too.
Thank you so much. This was super fascinating, and we have your book at the library in York, so please feel free to come by and check it out if anyone hasn't read it or hasn't had a chance to look at it. So thank you, Teresa, so much for joining us this evening, and have a really good night, everyone.
You too.
Thanks, Teresa.
Bye.